Hello and welcome to Veterans of the Valley. I'm Tom Turbyville. The mission of the 433rd Tactical Fighter Squadron out of Ubon Royal Thai Air Force Base was a difficult one. It was the height of the Vietnam War, and the North Vietnamese government treasured its only steel mill, located just north of Hanoi. A half dozen surface-to-air missiles and more than 1,000 anti-aircraft guns protected it. But it was the 433rd's mission to destroy it. March the 10th, 1967, then Captain Bob Pardo and Captain Earl Amon, each piloting F-4 Phantoms with their backseaters, Steve Wayne and Robert Houghton. Little did they know that that day they would make military aviation history. Ask any military flyer about Pardo's push, and they still marvel at the unbelievable story of how 4 airmen survived against the longest odds. Now retired Lieutenant Colonel Bob Pardo lives with his wife Catherine in College Station, and what a story he has to tell. Lieutenant Colonel Pardo, welcome. Thank you for being with us. We've set the scene here. Let's talk about the mission again on March 10th, 1967. This was obviously the only manufacturing plant for steel the North Vietnamese had. They were very interested in protecting it. You, the Air Force, were very interested in destroying it. Talk a little bit more about the mission.
The mission had been laid on 9 days before this event happened. We'd made several attempts to strike the target. However, each attempt was incomplete in that the weather was so bad we could not get to the target. And on the 10th of March, the weather cleared just enough that we were able to complete the strike. Strike force consisted of about 40 strike aircraft, F-105s and F-4s. Our flight was the last formation in the strike force. As we approached the target, about 40 miles north, Earl Amon, who was the number 4 man in our flight, was hit by anti-aircraft fire. A few lights came on, warning lights came on, but as he proceeded, the lights started to go back out, systems recovered. The airplane was flying very well, and so there was, he and his backseater, Bob Houghton, talked it over and decided that it would be fine if they continued the mission. So we continued on down towards the target. We were forced to fly lower than ordinary, so that when we did arrive at the target, we had to climb several thousand feet to get to our roll-in altitude for the bomb run. Just as the formation rolled in on the target, Earl got hit again. Since he was directly over the target, he saw no reason why he shouldn't continue. Go ahead and put his bombs on the target with everybody else.
This is a point I don't want to gloss over. He certainly had the option when he was hit the first time, much less the second time, that he could have gone right onto the tanker, said, I'm hit, I'm out of here. He chose not to do that.
Absolutely.
That kind of bravery right there tells you something about that gentleman, right?
Yes, it does.
Yes, indeed. Go ahead. Talk about what happened then.
Actually, after they were hit the first time, he and Bob talked it over, and they decided that they would say a little prayer. So they swapped flying the airplane. One guy would fly while the other one prayed. Then they'd change control, and the other guy would have his little prayer. And as I said, rolling in on the target, he got hit, and so he decided to continue. He could have left then also, but he decided to continue with the bomb run. Pulling off the target, Steve and I were hit pretty heavy. But the main thing at that point is simply to keep the formation together and head outbound. The first thing we do after coming off the target is get off of the strike frequency to reduce congestion on the air. Get a fuel check and a battle damage check. When we got the fuel check, we have a certain amount of gas that we need at the target in order to make it back to the base. We have another number that we use to determine if we can get back to the refueling tanker.
Right.
And for our purposes that day, 7,000 pounds of fuel was required to make it back to the base, 5,000 pounds to make it to the tanker. As our flight checked in, giving our fuel status to the flight leader, I was 2,000 pounds short of gas, which indicated that I at least might be able to make it to the tanker. But Earl was short 5,000 pounds. He was down to only 2,000 pounds remaining. That 2,000 pounds in a Phantom would not get him out of North Vietnam, much less to the tanker.
About how many minutes of flying time is there? 2,000 pounds.
Maybe 15 to 20 minutes.
Not much.
Not much.
No.
So it became obvious that he was not going to make it out of North Vietnam. Well, in the flatlands up there, if you go down, you basically have two different things that are going to happen. If the civilians captured you, they would probably kill you on the spot. If you were captured by the militia or the active military,
right,
you were going to prison. Neither of which is a very good option.
Certainly not.
So while we were outbound, Earl was having trouble keeping up with the formation. And so I started to lag behind and stay with him, just in case the MiGs came after us for a revenge kill on the way out. I still had missiles on board and significantly more fuel than he had, but they didn't attack, so we simply flew southwest until we crossed the Red River. As soon as you cross the Red River outbound to the west, things start getting better very quickly. Fewer guns, hardly any missiles, and so Earl felt that it was safe to climb. He wanted to climb as high as possible so that when he flamed out, he could glide as far as he could.
I want to stop you right there, and I want to show a picture of young Captain Bob Pardo and Captain Wayne here that we have ready. This is a photograph that was taken. When was this taken? Was this taken before this date or after this date? When was this taken? Do you recall?
I think it was taken a couple of weeks before. We had the squadron together for a class picture, you know, and while they were doing that, they let each individual crew have a picture made at the same time.
And you're standing in front of an F-4, is that right?
Yes.
There you go. You can.
The standard load on the airplanes on a bombing mission would be the huge tank you can see under the center of the airplane, 600 gallons of fuel, and then on the inboard pylons, 750-pound bombs.
Okay. Continue the story. I think you left off. Earl had gone high, so that if when he
flamed out,
right,
he would have maximum glide distance. Well, while we were climbing up to altitude, he had jettisoned everything off of his airplane that he could get rid of. Bomb racks, pylons, everything to reduce the drag. I had done the same thing, except my centerline tank wouldn't jettison. Ordinarily we jettison it inbound as soon as it's out of fuel, just to get rid of the drag, but my tank wouldn't jettison, so I still had it. We were looking his airplane over, and I'm thinking, the airplane is flying fine. He has perfect control of the airplane. He's simply going to run out of gas. And I thought there's got to be something we can do to get him to the jungle and out of the flatlands here. And it occurred to me that perhaps if he would jettison the drag chute, which is right on the tail end of the airplane, that I could put the nose of my airplane into the drag chute compartment and push. We attempted that, but the turbulence coming off of his airplane was so great that when we got within about 3 feet of him, it was just throwing us all over the sky, so we had to abandon that.
Right.
We backed away from him, dropped down underneath his airplane, and tried to put the top of our fuselage up against the belly of his airplane. And as we got within about a foot of his airplane, we could feel a vacuum or a suction pulling our airplane up against his. It had become obvious to Steve and I that we weren't going to make it either, that we were losing fuel apparently from battle damage.
Yes.
And that we were not going to make it, and we were going to have to eject. So we didn't want to damage the canopies, and possibly not be able to eject. So we backed away once more, and we just sat beneath his airplane, about like that. Fighter pilots can't talk without using their hands.
Right.
And we're looking up at the bottom of his airplane. And of course, the F-4 was originally designed for the Navy for use on carriers as fleet defense. So it's equipped with a tail hook for carrier landings.
Right.
Well, the Air Force retained the tail hook when we bought the airplane, so that we could put arresting gear on our runways. And if you came back to land with an emergency, the fire truck could park in one spot, and that's where you were going to be after you took the barrier. Well, I'm looking at the tail hook, and I thought, well, it's about 6 feet long, and it sticks down about a 45-degree angle below the airplane, gets us down below it pretty good. And I told Earl to drop the tail hook. And this all happened about the same time. He's running out of gas very fast, and there's only about 200 pounds left. And I said, just go ahead and shut it down, get rid of the jet wash. And then we were able to move in, put his tail hook in the middle of our windshield.
So he's a glider at
He
this time when
is now
when you've done
flying
that?
the world's heaviest glider.
About what speed were you going before he shut down the engine?
Well, best glide speed for the airplane is 250 knots, so that's how fast we were going. Once he flamed out, the rate of descent for the Phantom is about 3,000 feet a minute.
Right.
So from 36,000 feet, we just had over 10 minutes, and we were going to be in the jungle.
Okay, so the tail hook is deployed.
And we eased up very slowly, very gently, put it in the middle of the windshield, started adding power, and the vertical speed reduced to about 1,500 feet a minute. That essentially told us that we were going to double his glide distance, and we could see that we were going to make it into the jungle.
So I want people to get the picture of this. The tail hook, you have maneuvered your airplane, the windshield, and describe for me, you showed me one that you have at your home. The windshield of the F-4 is a vertical, sort of a long oval type with a flat bottom thing with an inch thick glass, right?
Yes, it's about an inch thick. It's sloped very sharply in front of the pilot. So with the hook in place, I'm looking at the hook about right there. And it started to gouge a few holes in the windshield. A few little cracks started to appear, and I had to move the hook to the bottom of the windshield and place it on a very small metal area that we used for de-icing. Hot air came out of this little metal section just beneath the windshield. That's on the F-4C model. Other models, it's different. But we were trying to stay away, as far away from his airplane as we could, to stay out of the turbulence coming off the bottom of the wing.
Right.
But that little bit of vertical movement on our part didn't seem to change things. So we were still able to keep the hook against the windshield and push. Now the hook swivels from side to side. It's held down hydraulically, but it is allowed to swivel from side to side. And there was no way we could fly perfectly straight so the hook would slide off the windshield.
So you could push it about what, like 20 to 30
20
seconds
to 30
at a time?
seconds at a time. And we'd back up 8 or 10 inches, put it back in the middle of the windshield or down at the bottom of the windshield, add the power, and go again. And so we were keeping his vertical speed at about 1,500 feet a minute. And then our left engine caught on fire. So we had to shut the left engine down. We went back in, tried it again, but now with one engine, we were only able to hold the vertical speed at about 2,000 feet a minute. And I told Steve it's getting rough because with one engine out, the airplane has a tendency to fly sideways. Mm-hmm. So I was having to use rudder to keep the airplane perfectly straight, which, although that doesn't sound like a big deal, under those circumstances, it did make it more difficult. And I said, Steve, I got to crank this thing back up. Ordinarily, you never restart an engine that's been on fire. But in this case, I thought the airplane's going to go in the jungle anyway. It doesn't matter if we do more damage. So I restarted the engine, and it lasted for about 2 minutes. Caught fire again, and I said, well, we've got to shut it down and leave it shut down, otherwise we may blow this thing up.
And this increased your descent rate then, right?
It increased the descent rate back to about 2,000 feet a minute. So we continued the remainder of the push, another 8 or 10 minutes on one engine. When we got down to about 6,000 feet above the ground, that's as low as I wanted to go, because people start shooting at you with rifles and pistols and throwing rocks at you. So we backed out from under him. He did have one radio working, and we told him to go ahead and punch. And we saw both seats leave the airplane, watched both parachutes open, and then Steve and I headed back to the northwest a little bit. He had been keeping track. All of our nav system was out, and he had been keeping track of where we were by following a map. And when he reported to the rescue people where these guys went down, when they got out there, he had them pinpointed within 1 mile.
About how long, Bob, from the time that you first engaged the tail hook on your windshield to the time that you reached 6,000 feet and you let him go, about how long a span of time was that?
About 20 minutes.
During that time, you all were in communication with each other?
We had radios, but we weren't talking.
You weren't talking. You were too busy, and you all were both too busy to have a whole lot of conversation.
Nothing to discuss.
He knew what you were doing. You knew what you had to do. Okay, so you let him go at 6,000 feet, and it's time for him to get out of there.
Yep. After we saw that they had both successfully ejected, we headed towards a special forces camp that we were pretty sure was only about 20 miles away. We didn't make it. We ran out of gas maybe within 2 minutes after we watched Earl and Bob eject. And I said, "That's it, Steve. I'll see you on the ground."
Because you were down to about 300 pounds of
yeah. By the time
gas
we
when you let him go,
finished
right?
by the time we finished the push, we were somewhere between 300 and 400 pounds, which is no more than a couple of minutes.
Right.
And so we were probably 10 or 12 miles short of the Special Forces camp. And I thought, well, once we're on the ground, we might hook up. We had always planned on trying to get together once we were on the ground if we were shot down. And I thought, if we can hook up, well, we can navigate our way over to the Special Forces camp.
Did you know that you had successfully gotten out of North Vietnam?
Yes.
And that you were?
Yes, we were.
Okay.
We were aware.
You were aware that you were in
Laos.
safer territory than you had been 20 minutes earlier?
Yes.
Okay.
Still enemy territory. The place where we went down was about 20 miles north of a town called Ban Ban, and it was communist headquarters for all of Laos. So we didn't pick a real good spot, but it was better than where we were.
Indeed.
And the jungle is a great place to hide, evade, and that's the primary reason we went. We wanted to be in the jungle.
Talk more about your rescue. The Jolly Greens came in?
Our flight leader and element leader had gone to the tanker to get fuel and come back and fly cover for us and start the rescue operation. And probably by the time Earl and Bob ejected, the helicopters probably were on their way. The helicopters are escorted by A-1E Sandys, a World War II prop fighter, and because they can stay slow enough to stay with the helicopters, but they always send one on ahead to get to the downed airmen and take care of identification. As many people as we had shot down, the North Vietnamese had a good collection of our survival radios, and so they would put an English speaker on a radio and try to talk the helicopters into coming in and picking them up.
Right.
And so we had to go through an identification process. And the guy asked me, what was my dog's name, what was my mother's maiden name, so forth. And finally he says, "What's your birthday?" And I said, 10 March. And he said, "Well, happy birthday." And it was the first that I realized that I was flying on my birthday.
I'll be darned.
I had never flown on my birthday since 1956, when I lost a friend on his birthday. Mm-hmm. And I said, that's not a very good way for the kids to remember their dad, so no. I never flew on my birthday.
Need to fast forward because I want you to tell a story. You're in the helicopter, and Something a little bit unusual happens, that if there's any humor to this day, this is when it happened.
Well, it was, the whole situation after we left the airplanes was pretty humorous, but the incident you're thinking of, I had just sat down on the bench on the side of the helicopter, and the helicopter had climbed a little bit above the trees and started back to the northwest, and I thought, we just came from up there. Why are we going to the north? And I'm sitting there contemplating this, and all of a sudden I hear one of the engines start to unwind on the helicopter. And the pararescue fellow turned and looked at me, and I must have had some weird expression on my face, because he came over and sat down beside me, and he said, "Captain," he says, "don't worry." He says, "the engine didn't quit." He said, "the pilot's on his first mission, and the instructor just gave him a simulated engine failure." I told him to ask them if they couldn't do their training some other time.
You'd had enough excitement for that
I'd
day.
had just about enough.
So you are rescued. We're going to go ahead and fast forward now years later, because I want to talk about how Pardo's push came about. But many years later, you're awarded the Silver Star, and that came about not real easily. I know that the late former Senator John Tower had something to do with that.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about being awarded the Silver Star, and as you're talking, as a matter of fact, we have a photograph of you being awarded the Silver Star. Go ahead and tell us about that.
Well, our organization was having a reunion, and one of my golf partners at the golf tourney asked me what award Steve and I had received. And I said, we didn't receive any awards. We were chewed out pretty severely, but we kind of let that blow over, and we just never bothered to talk about it. We didn't want any awards. Our reward was seeing our buddies come back. But he said, well, that's not good enough. And he talked to Senator Tower, who was in confirmation hearings for Secretary of Defense, and we were actually approved for the Air Force Cross. But in the process, that was downgraded to Silver Star. Mm-hmm. We went to Shaw Air Force Base, where Steve was still in the Air Force at the time. He had not retired yet. And he said, hey, my boss is a 3-star. He's a fighter pilot from Vietnam, a great guy. And so General Chuck Horner made the presentation. It was a wonderful event for our families. We didn't feel it was necessary.
Right. Want to fast forward again. We're going to put a picture up on the screen as soon as we get it here. These are 3 of the 4 of you. Lieutenant Colonel Amon is not at this picture. Talk a little bit about this photograph and when it was taken. I think it's going to be coming up on the screen here soon. There it is. You're in the middle.
The photograph was taken at Randolph Air Force Base. Mm-hmm. Each year after the POWs came back, a particular training squadron at Randolph was charged with the responsibility of getting the pilots, the POW pilots, recurrent in jet airplanes. And Earl lived in San Antonio.
Right.
So some friends said, okay, we want to bring Earl out for this event. It's a wonderful event. And they're going to bring some F-4s from Holloman Air Force Base up here and put them on static display. And it'd be great to get a picture of you and Earl together standing by the airplane or out by the airplane. I said, okay, why don't we go ahead and get both backseaters here? So after a few phone calls, we had assurances that Steve and Bob would be there. And we kind of stayed in the background until they rolled Earl out to look at the F-4.
Indeed, indeed. Go ahead.
He is not in the picture that you showed. Mm-hmm. He had been there signing prints for quite a while and became very tired, and he was on a respirator. And so we excused him to go back to the BOQ and lay down and get some rest. But that was the first time that the four of us had been together in 29 years.
We're going to show the audience a fascinating photograph, and as we're getting ready to show it, I want you to talk about it. Years later, you run into an artist whose primary work was military art, and there it is. Talk about this art piece.
I was at a military reunion in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and we were all sitting around having a cool one and telling war stories. And this artist that's been sitting there listening to some of this says, I'd like to hear a story about something besides a dogfight. Well, I really would have rather told him about my dogfight, but said, well, I can tell you one. I don't know what you can do with it. And I described the event to him, and he said, I think I'd like to do a picture of that. And this is the result. It's correct in every detail. The aircraft tail numbers are the exact same airplanes we were flying that day. If you look closely in the airplane that I'm flying, you can see a red star where one of my squadron buddies had shot down a MiG with that airplane the week before. You can see individual rivets. It's a wonderful piece of art.
Bob, in history books looking at the Vietnam War, probably our children and grandchildren will see it written that we did not win the Vietnam War. You disagree. You got about 1 minute. Tell us your thoughts on that.
Well, I'll put it very plainly. We didn't lose the war, and I want all the veterans out there to understand that we did not lose the war. Our troops, Army, Marines, beat them on the ground. Navy, Air Force, Marine pilots beat them in the air. We won the battles. We won the war. And then when our negotiators got to Paris, as soon as they got our POWs out, they gave it away. It was bargained away. Of course, we're very happy that we got the POWs out when we did, the way we did, because although victory would have been wonderful, total victory,
yes, sir,
that was not to be.
Thank you, Bob Pardo, for your service, and thank you for being here. It's an incredible story. The story that you have just heard is one that raises the bar of courage. Lieutenant Colonel Bob Pardo tells it with pride and with a heavy heart as he remembers his friend whose life he helped save more than 38 years ago. Pardo's push gave Earl Amon many more years until he faced a vicious and cruel enemy that he could not defeat, ALS, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. It is to his memory that we dedicate this program. You can go to your favorite internet search engine and type in Pardo's push and read a whole lot more. Please thank a veteran today. For Lieutenant Colonel Bob Pardo, I'm Tom Turbeville. Join us next time on Veterans of the Valley.